Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure and a blessing to see you all today. Thank you for being here. I want to thank Matt Bargander and Lee Peak for inviting me to speak today. And also I want to thank Jay and North Star Restoration Services for this lovely venue that we have for our meetings. The topic of my presentation today is climate change and our faith response to it. Certainly this is a topic that everyone talks about and everyone has an opinion about. I want to be upfront and tell you that I am not an expert in this field, and that's the cardinal sin of public speaking, is for someone at the beginning of their presentation to look you in the eye and say, well, I'm not really an expert in this field. My focus when I was a student at UW-Madison in the Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department, i.e. Weatherman School, was in day-to-day weather forecasting. So, of course, I did have some coursework in climate, the study of climate change, but that was never my real focus, and nor was it in my professional career. I'm going to go kind of quickly through my presentation, mainly because I don't call myself an expert. I want to try to just give you as much information from others that I think have more expertise, or at least have some, on the topic, but I do intend to leave some time for questions and answers at the end, because I want to hear what you have to say, not so much necessarily what I've spoken about, but just what your thinking is about this whole subject. So let me jump in and let's get to it. I want to give you first a couple formal definitions of climate. First, climate. Climate is defined as the composite or generally prevailing weather conditions of a region, such as temperature, air pressure, humidity, precipitation, sunshine, cloudiness, and winds throughout the year, averaged over a series of years. In the United States, current climate averages are based on a sliding 30-year period. And the current climate period is the 3 decades of 1990 through 2020. Okay? Weather, on the other hand, is defined as the current state of the atmosphere with respect to wind, temperature, cloudiness, moisture, pressure, etc. So an easier way to think of this is climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. So for example, I have some friends who are vacationing now down in Arizona. And what kind of weather why do you go to Arizona? Well, because we expect we're going to have sunshine and nice temperatures and low humidity, et cetera, but is that necessarily what they're going to receive? Well, you find out when you get there. And just some information for you, since it's turned rather snowy here the last several weeks. March snowfall in Wausau is officially at 20.7 inches, which is 16.5 inches above average for this point in March. The current snowfall for the entire winter season in Wausau is 76.5 inches, 23 inches above average. Okay, so we've done well in terms of receiving precipitation of late, especially. Hopefully we can get a nice gentle melt of this, and that'll set us up for a nice spring. So I want to ask you a question, and that is, when you think about climate and all this stuff and climate change, what do you think of when you think of the topic of climate change? Obviously, everybody should have an opinion on it. You hear it almost daily in the news. When you think of climate change, what do you think of? Anybody? Politics? Oh. Anything else? What is okay? Anything else? Climate change. When you think of climate, current popular opinion in terms of climate change is that temperatures are rising irreversibly. Heat waves, droughts, floods, and wildfires are worsening. Sea levels are rising. Storms, such as hurricanes and tornadoes, are increasing in frequency and intensity. That's some of the commonly professed opinions and statements about climate change. And why is the climate changing, especially in the ways described? Well, it's because of carbon dioxide emissions and other gas emissions, the so-called greenhouse gases, due to human industrialization. Okay? we are led to believe that these are the facts, that the climate is irreversibly changing. Everything's getting worse, right? That's what we're led to believe. And perhaps more importantly, that those opinions, those statements are settled. There's no room for discussion anymore. It's settled. We've got this baby nailed. But in reality, the truth is there are a lot of different opinions on the subject. Now, part of my talk is based on this book. It's called Unsettled. The subtitle is What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. It was written by Stephen Koonin, who was the former Undersecretary for Science, U.S. Department of Energy in the Obama administration. Koonin has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed papers in the fields of physics and astrophysics, scientific computation, energy policy, and climate science. He was a professor of theoretical physics at Caltech and is currently a professor at New York University. So I'm going to jump to a few conclusions that Koonin makes in his book about climate change. It is true, he says, that the globe is warming and that humans are exerting a warming influence upon it. But recent published research literature or the latest assessments of climate science published by the U.S. government and the United Nations say clearly that heat waves in the U.S. are now no more common than they were in 1900, that the warmest temperatures in the U.S. have not risen in the past 50 years. Additionally, humans have had no detectable impact on hurricanes over the past century. Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago. The net economic impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal through at least the end of this century. So how do we determine what the truth is? And certainly it isn't easy because, as Koonin discusses in his book, climate science involves many different scientific fields, encompassing the quantum physics of molecules and the classical physics of moving air, water, and ice, the chemical processes in the atmosphere and ocean, the geology of the solid earth, and the biology of ecosystems. It also includes the technologies used to do the science, including computer modeling on the world's fastest machines, remote sensing from satellites, paleoclimate analysis, looking at what we can see has happened in the past from various means, paleoclimate analysis, and advanced statistical methods. Then there are the related areas of government policy, economics, and the energy technologies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In short, the study of climate and energy is the ultimate multidisciplinary activity. And that's another reason why I'm going to tell you that I'm not an expert on this, because I don't have expertise in all these various fields. But this is one reason why I like Koonin's book, because he worked for a Democrat administration. He claims he's a Democrat. Now, political affiliation in this topic shouldn't matter, right? It shouldn't matter. But I like this guy because he likes to look at facts. He actually looks at a statement and tries to find some facts that either back it up or knock it down. And I admire that. That's what we should all be doing in all aspects of life, and that's why I'm basing at least part of my presentation on his book. One of the nice things about the book, and I'm not going to take the time to go through chapter by chapter, but most of the things I just listed in terms of all the aspects of studying climate change, all the different fields of science, technology that are involved, he talks about in the book, the pros and cons of each aspect. So I encourage you to get the book. I really encourage you to get the book. It's written in a form that you don't have to be very scientifically minded to understand it. And I think you would enjoy it. And I think perhaps even more so, it will give you some important insight on the topic, which is something that we all need. So after reviewing the topics in the book, then these are some additional conclusions that Koonin makes. Humans exert a growing but physically small warming influence on the climate. The deficiencies of climate data challenge our ability to untangle the response to human influences from poorly understood natural changes. So obviously a lot of the focus that we hear in the media and from government is, well, what's influencing climate change is mainly the result of human activities, industrialization, anthropogenic stuff. Well, but actually, no, that's not quite the case. There's a lot of other natural processes that are just going on in the created world that could have an influence on the long-term average weather conditions or the climate. The results from the multitude of computer climate models disagree with or even contradict each other and many kinds of observations. Again, that's another thing that we often hear is that, well, the climate models are settled. There's a vast agreement and that the Earth is irreversibly warming and it's going to be hard to turn the tide on this. No, he spends a whole chapter talking about that. And again, I encourage you to read it. Government and United Nations press releases and summaries do not actually reflect the reports themselves. That's true. Part of that is because of media manipulation. In short, the science is insufficient to make useful projections about how the climate will change over the coming decades, much less what effect our actions will have on it. You may disagree with that, and that's fine. But again, I encourage you to read the book because he states his case. He states the facts upon which he's making those claims. So a few initial takeaways from all these statements I've discussed so far. The world's climate is and does change. Human activity certainly has an influence on it, but there are many other potential causes. These include natural variation in the Earth, such as volcanic activity, plate tectonics, changes in the Earth's rotation and transit around the sun, and changes in the solar output. Okay. Some of you may know, I don't know to what degree, there certainly have been many different climate changes during the Earth's history of various timescales, including the dinosaur era and the Ice Age, many of which occurred before human industrialization. So it's just something to think about. Again, most of the time, our current discussion that we hear about this topic of climate change is always shrouded in the effect of, well, it's something we've never seen before. And well, that's baloney. I mean, things have always been changing, and that's one of the amazing things about the Earth and the atmosphere system is that it's been here so long and it's still here, even in spite of our few hundred years of industrialization. So in conclusion, popular opinion is that human activities, specifically during the recent Industrial Revolution, with its associated consumption of fossil fuels, are leading to irreversible change in the Earth's climate. Again, that's one thing that really sticks with me, is that it's implied that things are changing and there's no going back, or they're only changing for the worse. Okay, so why is continued dialogue on this topic of climate change so important? Well, here's the other crux of the matter. Now climate change is not just related to a scientific endeavor that you may have in some university, schools and whatnot. It's now an issue of worldwide and regional governance affecting decisions regarding political, economic, industrial, social, and energy policy. There's so many things that are now have become intertwined with this climate change topic. And with governance comes the ability to control the lives and destinies of people. As a result, much of the Western world governance is now focused on the elimination of fossil fuel consumption completely and as soon as possible, and most of the media coverage is in agreement with this view. In reality, as I've already mentioned, such opinions are not the true consensus. I mean, that's another thing that you hear. Oh, climate, this is settled. The climate is changing and it's settled and there's consensus on this. But there's not, okay? And so now what I want to do is just take a few moments. I've got a whole stack of articles that I could refer to, and I'm just going to refer to a few of them because I want to show for you that there are differing opinions from perhaps what we consider well-read and reasoned people. The first I want to read is a few brief excerpts from an opinion piece written by Yoweri Museveni, who is the president of Uganda. This appeared in the Wall Street Journal on October 25th, 2021. The president says, Africa can't sacrifice its future prosperity for Western climate goals. The continent should balance its energy mix, not rush straight toward renewables. Conservative estimates project that Africa's population of 1.3 billion will double by 2050. Africans' energy consumption will likely surpass that of the European Union around that same time. Knowing this, many developed nations are pushing an even accelerated transition to renewables on Africa. The Western Aid industrial complex, composed of non-governmental organizations and state development agencies, has poured money into wind and solar projects across the continent. This earns them praise in the US and Europe, but leaves many Africans with unreliable and expensive electricity that depends on diesel generators or batteries on overcast or still days. Generators and the mining of lithium for batteries are both highly polluting. African manufacturing will struggle to attract investment and therefore to create jobs without a consistent energy source or sources. Agriculture will suffer if the continent can't use natural gas to create synthetic fertilizer or to power efficient freight transportation. In this gentleman's opinion, a better solution is for Africa to move slowly toward a variety of reliable green energy sources. All this will take time, meaning Africa will have to use fossil fuels as it makes the transition. Natural gas is a greener option that will help the continent reduce emissions even as it grows, as developed nations have done themselves. Saying any of this will meet with backlash from developed nations. Instead of reliable renewables or greener fossil fuels, aid money and development investments go to pushing solar and wind with all their accompanying drawbacks. And many Western nations have put a blanket ban on public funding for a range of fossil fuel projects abroad, making it difficult for Africa to make the transition to cleaner non-renewables. So that's the opinion of the president of Uganda. Here's an opinion piece written by a fellow named Bjorn Lomborg, who is president of the Copenhagen Consensus and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. The topic of this presentation was climate activists blow smoke on wildfire fears. He writes, add wildfires to the long list of natural disasters that are overhyped in climate coverage. In the early 1900s, about 4.2% of land worldwide burned every year. A century later, that had dropped almost to 3%. That decline has continued through the satellite era, through which we make many observations continuously of the Earth's surface. And 2021 is likely to end with only 2.5% of the globe having caught fire, based on data through August 31st. Why, he says? Well, human ingenuity gets the credit. People have moved from hearths to power stations, converted untamed land into protected farms, and created enough excess wealth that societies can increasingly afford to defend our surroundings with fire suppression and forest management. Climate studies that predict significantly more wildfires typically ignore this history. They model only temperature changes, excluding what people might do in response. So Mr. Lomborg isn't denying that perhaps there isn't some human influence on climate, and maybe the climate temperatures are warming some. But that's not the only thing we consider when you look at wildfires. What's going on with some of the land being burned and whatnot? Specifically for the U.S., while the share of the U.S. burned by wildfires has risen since the 1980s, influenced in part by climate change, that's not the whole story. Fires in the U.S. today burn less than a fifth of the area that was scorched each year in the 1930s, and an expert panel found that the recent uptick is mostly the result of poor forest management. It is true that more people will probably be threatened by fires in the future, but this is because part of the world's growing population will settle where wildfires are more common. They're moving to where the fires occur. The number of homes in high fire risk zones in the western U.S. has increased 13-fold over the past 80 years and is set to increase further by 2050. A 2016 Nature study concludes this is true globally. Contrary to common perception, the researchers write, human exposure to wildfires increases in the future, mainly owing to projected population growth in areas with frequent wildfires, rather than by a general increase in burned area. So just a little bit of some comments on one of the cogs of climate change being wildfires. Here's an article also written by Bjorn Lomborg about, the topic is The Lancet's Heat Death Deception. The Lancet is an international general medical journal. And I'll just have a few comments from this. He says, as he begins, one recent and much cited Lancet report appears deliberately deceptive. The study offers a frightening statistic. Rapidly rising temperatures have increased annual global heat deaths among older people by 68% in less than 2 decades. Again, rapidly rising temperatures have increased annual global heat deaths among older people by 68% in less than 2 decades. He goes on to say annual heat deaths have increased significantly among people 65 and older worldwide. The average deaths per year increased 68% from the early 2000s to the late 2010s. But that is almost entirely because there are so many more older people today than there were 20 years ago, in no small part thanks to medical innovations that keep us alive longer. Measured across the same time span, the Lancet maps heat deaths. The number of people 65 and older has risen by 60%, or almost as much as heat deaths. When the increase in heat mortality is adjusted for this population growth, the actual rise that can be attributed to rising temperatures is only 5%. And this next point is really important. He goes on to say, this study by the Lancet also cherry picks data by discussing only heat deaths. Around the world, far more people die each year from cold than heat. In the US and Canada, between 2000 and 2019, an average of 20,000 people died from heat annually and more than 170,000 from cold. Temperatures rose throughout the 20th century, but the US nonetheless saw a decrease in heat deaths, largely thanks to air conditioning. Policies that focus on lifting people out of poverty and providing affordable, reliable sources of energy would allow the rest of the world to reduce heat deaths and live more comfortable lives. They would also help starve off the much greater threat of cold deaths. So that's that. Here's an opinion piece by Alicia Finley in the Wall Street Journal. This was written or published on February 13th of this year. The topic is The Climate Crusaders Are Coming for Electric Cars Too. I think you might find this interesting. She begins, replacing all gasoline-powered cars with electric vehicles won't be enough to prevent the world from overheating. Let's say that again. Replacing all gasoline-powered cars with electric vehicles won't be enough to prevent the world from overheating. So people will have to give up their cars. That's the alarming conclusion of a new report from the University of California, Davis, and a network of academics and policy experts called the Climate and Community Project. The report offers an honest look at the vast personal, environmental, and economic sacrifices needed to meet the left's net zero climate goals. Net zero just means when are we going to get to the point when we'll have a net amount of zero greenhouse gases emitted. Progressives' dirty little secret is that everyone will have to make do with much less. Fewer cars, smaller houses and yards, and a significantly lower standard of living. And then she goes on to address some issues related to electric cars, specifically the mining of the minerals needed for electric cars is both expensive and polluting unto itself. And then she goes on to say, the report concludes that the auto sector's current dominant strategy, which involves replacing gasoline-powered vehicles with electric vehicles without decreasing car ownership and use, is likely incompatible with climate activists' goal to keep the planet from warming by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with pre-industrial times. Instead, the report recommends government policies that promote walking, cycling, and mass transit. I think I have one more. Yes, this is an opinion piece by the Wall Street Journal editorial board, so it's opinion, but just hear me out here. Entitled, "Water is a Terrible Thing to Waste." This was published January 18th of this year. California's political leaders are obsessed with climate, so why don't they prepare for droughts or deluges? The atmospheric rivers, i.e. the steady progression of storms that swept across the southwestern U.S. early this year, including the Golden State, should be a cause for relief, but they've instead given way to catastrophic floods and enormous water waste. Storms this winter have already dropped tens of trillions of gallons of water across the state of California and more than a dozen feet of snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Alas, little of the storm runoff is getting captured. One problem is the state's lack of investment in public works, especially storage and flood control. Drought has recurred throughout California history, punctuated by wet winters like this one. 2 7-year droughts that started in the late 1920s and the 1940s spurred the construction of a massive system of canals, dams, and reservoirs. But few large water projects have been built since the birth of the modern environmental movement in the 1970s. Species protections for salmon and 3-inch smelt limit how much water can be pumped south through the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta, which receives runoffs from rivers in the north and the Sierra Mountains. The amount of water surging into the delta on the Friday before this was published could have filled a reservoir the size of Yosemite's Hetch Hetchy almost every 24 hours. Instead, nearly 95% of the delta's stormwater this year has flushed into the Pacific Ocean. State voters have approved 8 water bonds since the year 2000 that authorize some $27 billion in funding for various water projects. But little of the money has gone to storage or flood control. That's because politicians buy off green support for water bonds by promising to spend a large share of their proceeds on ecosystem restoration. It's opinion, but that's something to think about. And I think, and they also express some other facts and data in here that support their claims in terms of where some of the budgets have gone that have supposedly, or bond monies that have been supposedly raised for climate change. All right, 2 more real quick. We got time. This is another opinion piece written by the fellow I referenced earlier, Bjorn Lomborg, and the title was "The Inflation Reduction Act Does Little to Reduce Climate Change." Top administration officials are fanning out across the U.S. in a victory lap for the new Inflation Reduction Act. This was written last August, which President Biden calls the most significant legislation in history to tackle the climate crisis. America, we are told, is a global climate leader again. This narrative has serious problems, however. The foremost issue is that the act will have a trivial impact on climate change. The administration claims the law will enable the U.S. to reduce carbon emissions in 2030 by around 40% below 2005 levels. This is less than the 50% reduction Mr. Biden promised only last year, but it still sounds impressive. One major wrinkle, however, is that most of that cut has nothing to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. Unlike most other nations on the planet, the U.S. has substantially reduced its carbon emissions over the past 15 years. This is largely owing to the fracking revolution that replaced a lot of America's coal with natural gas, which is cheaper and cleaner. Even without the new law, the U.S. was on track to cut emissions substantially by 2030, according to research by the Rhodium Group. Averaging their high and low emissions predictions, the U.S. would drop emissions by almost 30% absent the new law. With the new law, emissions will decline instead by a little over 37%. The most significant legislation in history will actually cut emissions by less than 8 percentage points. And I won't get into the details. He even goes further in this article to talk about some of the spending that's associated with this and what return we would get. He's obviously pointed that out. And it's his opinion. My final additional little essay here is, is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Letters and Science Journal to its members. This was as of spring of 2021. So about 2 years ago this time, this article was published. And it's called Uneasy Truths. All right, just a few comments from this that just tickle my fancy. Maybe it will do something for you too. I read, the concept of truth has taken a massive beating over the past several years. Again, this is the opinion of one of the colleges of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'll start again. The concept of truth has taken a massive beating over the past several years. Our political discourse on critical topics facing our nation, for example, who won the 2020 presidential election, is climate change real, can masks and social distancing help prevent the spread of COVID-19, has been warped by rampant waves of disinformation spread by social media platforms, manipulative politicians, and a proliferating number of partisan news outlets. We're in the middle of this new toxic stew that leads to a substantial portion of citizens to refuse to believe the plain and verifiable truth, says Mike Wagner, a professor of journalism whose research sits at the intersection of media and politics. While this modern truth-trashing phenomenon has accelerated over the past 4 years, it began 4 decades ago. Wagner pins it to the rise of conservative talk radio in the 1980s, led by pundits such as the late Rush Limbaugh. The rise of conservative-leaning Fox News network in the 1990s quickly became the second pillar. Both of these sources provided an alternative to mainstream news coverage, and both of these sources told their audiences that mainstream news coverage was not to be trusted, Wagner explains. Fast forward to today, where our social media-driven world makes big lies and wild conspiracy theories easier to spread than carefully researched facts. It's hard to imagine how we return to widespread trust of institutions such as the Centers for Disease Control or the long-standing news outlets with more than a century's worth of adherence to rigorous standards of journalism and awards recognizing that rigor. Most experts agree that our access to and use of social media, primarily Facebook and Twitter, has been at the center of the disinformation storm, amplifying the ability of bad actors and uninformed citizens to spread wild conspiracy theories that sow division and influence the outcome of elections. Now, my main take of all this is that disinformation is being pinned on only one side. That's all I'm going to say on that. I'm sorry, that infuriates me. That's all I'm going to say on that. And that's from where I went to school. So I'm really just utmost pleased about that. Okay. All right, so I hope at least in the time that I've had so far, given you a little bit of a perspective on climate change and some ideas about it. Now the question is, how do we mitigate it? Well, we know a lot about what Western governments want to do, including the United States. I'm just wondering if maybe we could do something a little bit more fair. How about minimize private airplane travel? It's gone. Private airplanes consume a lot of energy and belch out a lot of carbon emissions at a much higher frequency than and less efficiently than commercial passenger jets do. Here's a big one for me. Reorganize college and professional athletic leagues. I'm waiting for my department, the University of Wisconsin Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, to come out and say, why are we allowing USC and UCLA to join the Big Ten? Do you realize that what that's going to mean? As far as I know, that means that those two schools in California are going to be participating in all sports, and they're going to be flying at the farthest from Los Angeles to Piscataway frequently. Okay, just saying. You know, why can't we have a reorganization of our athletic leagues based on geographics? I mean, we kind of do now, but certainly the Big Ten is spread out all over the place now. Why can't we just reorganize to minimize the amount of travel? Okay. Rethink nuclear power. There's countries in Europe that are certainly doing that now. Here's one that I know is going to bristle a few of you, but just a thought. Again, you have your own, but just to stimulate some thought. Do away with motorized racing. That may be an interest of you. That may be where some of you derive income. I'm just throwing out ideas here. Again, the idea is to seek actions that will cause the least amount of disruption to the highest number of people. Okay. All right. As I've already said, I'll say it one more time. I thank you for your attention today, this noon hour. I'm not an authority on this. I try to read as much as I can. I'll admit to you, I'm retired, so sometimes I'd rather do more volunteering. I've been blessed with the opportunity to do that. So I don't spend as much time following all this stuff. But I do have the answer. Who is the supreme authority on this subject? God Almighty, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Colossians 1, verses 15 to 18, we read, He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God. I'm sorry, I get a little emotional, right? Just read this because this is an act of worship to me. The firstborn over all creation. For by Him, Christ, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. How profound. Or from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these days, in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom He made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being. Can you imagine that? That's one reason why I like the television series The Chosen. Because whether or not there's some debate, sometimes they're getting all the facts right, but the gentleman that plays the role of Christ, I watch him thinking, that could be what Christ, he's a person. That's just, to me, that's deeply profound. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. I'll say it again. Sustaining all things by His powerful word. So if we read that and accept it on faith, that says that Jesus right now sustains the universe by the power of His spoken word. It's true, absolutely. From Colossians 2, verse 8, we read, See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. From 1 Corinthians 2, verses 9 to 16, we read, However, as it is written, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. That's from Isaiah. But God has revealed it to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to spiritual men. The man without the Spirit does not accept these things that come from God, from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subjected to any man's judgment. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? From Isaiah. But we have the mind of Christ. Oh, amen. From John chapter 10:27, Jesus said, "My sheep listen to my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Proverbs 2, verse 6, "For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." Proverbs 16, verse 3, "Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and your plans will succeed." Jeremiah 33:3, "Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." So my suggestion to me and all of us here today, and my prayer, is that we need to seek Christ's guidance in this subject of climate change, but then in reality in every aspect of our lives. And that's nothing profound coming from me, but we have to do it. I mean, do we believe this or not? Christ is the creator, redeemer, and sustainer. It says in Scripture that he sustains the entire universe just by the power of what he speaks. So why wouldn't we want to seek his guidance as we go forward in the governance of the lives that we lead and the lives that we lead as in citizens in our countries and in the world? I want to very quickly mention to you, I was asked to speak several years ago to a mainstream Christian denominations women's group that was having a weekend seminar on social issues. One included climate change and our reaction to it. And before my presentation, I went on to the website of the organization, just wanted to find out information about what they're doing and this stuff. And I was surprised, dare I say stunned, there was no reference to the Creator. There was no reference to Christ as being the Creator and Redeemer and Sustainer of all things. So when I made my presentation, at the end of it, I said to them, now I have to just tell you, after spending some time on your website and your literature, I don't see any reference to you, to Christ, and especially to prayer. In the room, you could hear a pin drop, and they were just looking at me like, gee, I don't know. Now, I'm not saying that to be derisive of them, but this is a Christian organization, and they had no clue to talk about prayer. We are exhorted frequently to pray, pray, pray in all things, for all things, all the time. I don't do a good job. In fact, I'm 64 years old now, and if I was to state to you one of the biggest challenges I face in my life going forward, it's the discipline of prayer. I'm not as good as I would like to be, or perhaps as I should be. But there's power in it. You know that. And I want to encourage you in that. Okay, so let's see. So here's my closing statement, and I think we'll have maybe a minute or two for questions if you have. It is certainly true that human activities impact the world around us. You may remember acid rain, air pollution, and land use, but human ingenuity has or can help to mitigate these problems, and not by imposition, but by freedom. That's what we enjoy in this country. But in all aspects of our daily lives and in every day, we should seek the guidance of the ultimate source of freedom, the very Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer of all things. So my time is about up. So any questions or comments? Yes?
Yeah, I just had another good verse to kind of throw into the mix here is Genesis 8:22, which says, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease."
Yes?
Going back to about the fires in the woods, I wonder if part of it, you say it's decreasing. I wonder if part of it is, 30 years ago, how many of us had a pack of cigarettes in our back pocket?
Well, that's true too. Yes, absolutely. Very good point. Yes.
One question, I guess, early statement you made was that the ice in Greenland is not shrinking any faster than it has in the past. How can truly honest scientists look at the same data and draw totally different conclusions? That's a great question.
I give you the answer really briefly, quickly. It's the money, honey. Seriously, I don't want to sound flippant. Why in the world doesn't the University of Wisconsin Atmospheric and Oceanic Science Department come out with a policy statement saying we don't want the Big Ten to expand, we don't want additional pollution? There are other atmospheric and oceanic science departments at Ohio State, at the University of Michigan, Purdue, Penn State University is a leader. I've not heard a peep from them. And you know why? Because they're going to get money out of it. I'm sorry I'm so enthused about this. But on the one hand, how can you tell us that what we're doing, I'm driving my car here today, is leading to the destruction of the earth and its atmosphere, and on the other hand, you're saying, hey, come and join us and let's send regular flights from Los Angeles to Piscataway. It don't make no sense to me. I'm sorry. Yes?
How much do you think the weather, I mean, you were on TV for years and out and stuff. How much do you think the weather controls people? How much do you think the weather controls people?
I think very much so. I mean, obviously the weather impacts everything we do. Regardless of what we do for work or leisure, it impacts everything. So I think that's why this topic is so profound and important. I don't have time, but I wanted to, if I had time, I was going to open a discussion on, well, how do you run a business these days? Or if you're involved in government, and if you're a believer, how do you put your faith into action? Because, you know, these days, even though we still have some religious freedom in this country, we can't stand up and say, Jesus Christ is the author and finisher of our faith. And perhaps quote what I read from Hebrews. You can't do it. We shouldn't do it. I don't, you know, that's the nature of our society and our government. So how do you that are leaders, I was never a leader, I was a staffer. But how do you as leaders live this out when you have to interact with the government or with others? Hopefully at least you're at home in your closet praying for this. And hopefully like me, you'll continue to do a better job at it. Because as I said, I'm not doing that well. I wish I could do better. But it's a tough situation because we know the truth. If once you accept Christ and the Holy Spirit indwells you, you receive that information from God. It's given to you. And so I don't believe necessarily that Christ is the all in all. I know He is, and hopefully you do too. But yet, am I supposed to separate that from me when I interact with my government leaders? Or it's a question I don't know, but I pray for you that our leaders, that you'll have discernment on that issue. Yes.
Being that you were in that mainstream environment with news, how is your relationship with Christ? How is that accepted or perceived? Conversations at work on the local level?
I never talked about it that much in meetings with my associates at work, but I found ways that I could profess my faith when I was on television. Like I would say, what a glorious day this is. Let's be thankful for the fact that the rains have stopped and we can dry some out and get the farmers back. And there were some subtle ways that I could at least kind of give the nod. I pray daily for an accurate forecast, and usually the times, well, they're very infrequent, but the times, but usually the times when I was wrong was when I would think, oh no, Lord, I got this, man, I got this, I can get this on my own. So, any other questions or comments? I do want to thank you all, and I'm praying for us all and all of you. I really appreciate you being here today. And again, I strongly recommend you to get this book by Stephen Coonan. Also, there's another organization called the Heartland Institute. I don't have time to deal with it today, but again, they'll just give you some differing information, a different view of things at times. And you can decide for yourselves whether or not it's good or a bunch of hooey. So, thank you.
Thank you.